a small class of half an hour mostly, and here I will discuss in brief about Wordsworth's ideas, language and diction of poetry, and how Coleridge criticized this idea. Now, as we all know that Wordsworth and Coleridge came in contact to each other in 1796, and from that time onwards they had a sort of discussion on poetry, the nature of poetry, about poetic diction, about the creative and the composition of poetry and what actually goes on. And the result was the publication of the preface to the lyrical ballads in 1798. And we all know that as that was the result of a discussion, so lyrical ballads was a joint venture, and later Coleridge said that it is half the child of his brain. But later we see that Coleridge departed and in some points rather controverted Wordsworth's idea on poetic diction and about poetic theories and what actually Coleridge wanted to establish by criticizing Wordsworth is that the poetic creation, the nature of the poetic creation, and the nature and action of imagination, they are quite different from what Wordsworth wanted to propound and propose in his lyrical ballads. In Biographia Literaria, chapter 17 and 18, we see that Coleridge actually criticizes Wordsworth's ideas and Wordsworth's notions about the language and diction of poetry and Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction. Now, in preface to the lyrical ballads, Wordsworth three important statements which was rather objected by Coleridge in his Biographia Literaria. So the first thing that Wordsworth said, that Wordsworth writes that he chose low and rustic life as a theme of his poems. That's what published in lyrical ballads. He chose low and rustic life because he gives the reason, because in that condition the essential passions of the heart find a better soil. So he says that the essential passion, the passion, you cannot explain what passion actually means, but passion, you can say that it's a sort of deep feeling, what goes on in our mind, seeing or observing anything. Or passion can be termed, or it can be explained as the reaction of the mind to certain impressions that we receive. Now he says that this slow and rustic life gives a better soil to the essential passions of our heart, and it matures us. He says essential passions, they mature because of their interaction with the low and rustic life. Why? Because this low and rustic life, they remain unaffected by all the artificialities which you won't get in an urban space or in an urban culture. So he says that these passions that come in contact with the low and rustic life are less under restraint, and they speak a plainer and a more emphatic language. Wordsworth says that the rustic and low life, they are plain, they are unaffected, they are beyond the clutches of artificiality, and that's why they have a sort of emphatic nature in them. The language of low and rustic life is very much emphatic. And he says that because in that condition of life, because in that low and rustic life, our elementary feelings, elementary means our basic feelings, coexist they coexist in a state of greater simplicity and consequently may be more accurately contemplated and more forcibly communicated. Now, this is a very big idea that Wordsworth gives. He says that the language of the low and rustic life, that is more emphatic. It has a power to emphasize its feelings, and there in that low and rustic life, our elementary feelings, they stay together, they coexist in a state of greater simplicity. It remains unaffected by any kind of artificiality. And as a result, because of this unaffectedness, as a result, they are more accurately contemplated. They helps the mind to contemplate, to concentrate, because it remains unaffected, untouched by any other impurities that are there around. And greater simplicity and maybe more accurately contemplated, at the same time more forcibly communicated. And because it is pure, it is unaffected, it can forcibly communicate, it has a force to communicate, because of rural life, this low and rustic life, which Wordsworth says that you can find it in the rural space. So the countries are the heart, the city space is the mind. So this is the basic binary that we see, the country space and the city space. Country is the heart, city is the mind or the brain. So something like this. Heart means where remains the pure passion, and when it is something related to brain, it means it works over it has a sort of mixture of many things. External stimuli, they actually affect the brain, and that's why the result is something a thinking. We mix our passion with the things that go on in our brain, our cerebral thinking. So Wordsworth says that this country life, which is very much of the heart, is unaffected by all the externalities, artificialities. And the rural life germinate from this elementary feelings and from the necessary character of rural occupation. So you will see that Wordsworth takes up in rural occupations. He writes poem about a solitary reaper, about the leech gatherer. They are very common people. They have no such artificialities in them. They remain unaffected by the urban artificialities. They come up from the very plain, simple rural life. That's why Wordsworth says that to describe them, to describe the elementary passions that we find in and around people and their nature, and their surroundings, your language also need to be more simple, and they should come up from the rustic and life. The rural occupations are most easily comprehended and more durable, because in that condition, he says that in that condition, in that rural rustic life, the passions of men, may not women, whatever you can say, men, are incorporated. He says that here the passion gets incorporated, means becomes a part of the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. He says that when I am taking up the rustic and rural life, I am having a sort of connection with the permanent forms of nature. So country is more associated, connected with nature. The city is distanced from nature. City is something which have been constructed, and when you construct something, it gets distanced from the original, the nature. This is what Wordsworth wanted to say. Now, this is the reason for his choice of rustic themes. Wordsworth chooses rustic themes because this is the reason. He says that I deliberately choose the low and rural life, the rustic life, because it is closely connected to nature, where one can have a taste of the elementary passions of one's mind, which is more emphatic and which can communicate more simply without getting interrupted by all the other external stimuli. Now, he says that reasons first is the reason for his choice. Now, the choice of rustic language. The why. Secondly, he says that the language too of this man is adopted. He says that I am adopting. Adopting means I'm taking. I'm adopting means not adapting, but I'm adopting. I'm taking. I'm receiving. The language too of this man is adopted because such men hourly communicate with the best objects. So what considers as the best objects? The objects which are natural. And he says that these people who come from the low and rustic life, they most of the time they are associated with nature. Here actually he says that the men adopted the language because they hourly communicate with the best objects, from which the best part of language is originally derived. According to Wordsworth, the language that these people speak, he wants to adopt that language because their language is closely associated with the best of the nature, and that's why, according to Wordsworth, that is the best language, the language which is pure, which is unaffected. Now, pure means purified indeed from what appeared to be its real defects. Now here you will see that Coleridge later will criticize that what actually Wordsworth wanted to mean by pure. So when something I'm talking of pure and purity and purification, pure means something pure, where there is no adulteration, no mixture. Now, purity means the nature, the quality of being pure. And purification means, when I'm talking of purification, purification is the is an activity, is a process where you are giving something, you are interacting with something to make it pure. Now, there is a contradiction in this idea of purification. When I'm purifying something, that means there is a sort of adulteration, a mixture. That means it proves that what I meant by pure is actually the state where it has nothing added to it. But when I am purifying something, that means the pure thing is, there is something added to the pure thing, to the pure object or the thing. And what I am doing, I am trying to separate the impure thing from the pure thing. That means I am purifying. So when the process of purification is there, that means there is a sort of intervention. I'm interventing into the thing, and I'm trying to separate the pure from the impure. I'm trying to retrieve the pure thing by separating the impure thing. Then when I'm purifying something, the purifying thing, suppose the pure thing was X and it got mixed up with the impure Y, and when I'm purified and separated Y from X, the new purified thing is X1. So there is a basic difference between X and X1. So the language which is purified, that means a kind of intervention was there. That's why it got purified. Now, when I'm talking of purified, purified indeed from what appeared to be its real defects. So, when I'm talking of purification, then what Wordsworth says, there is a sort of, Wordsworth used the word purified. Now, when Wordsworth talks of something which is pure, the language of the low and rural people, that is a pure language, and then Wordsworth purifies it, then that means that Wordsworth actually admits that what he considered to be the most pure thing, which is closely associated with nature, he has to purify that by separating or by distancing the very pure thing from those things which are its defects, or which can be termed as impure things. So purification is there. That means that he has to separate its defects and to purify the pure from all lasting and rational causes of dislike or disgust. He says that. So he says that I am taking the language of these men who are low and rustic. So because these people have communication, they can communicate, for hourly communicate with the nature and with the pure things of nature, best objects, and the best part of language comes out from their interaction with nature. And because of their rank in society, they belong to the very lower rung of the society. They are very common people. Because of their rank in society and the sameness and narrow circle of their intercourse, so they are having a sort of intercourse with nature, or with interaction with the people around them, and all these people belong to the same rank. You will find in the city space, in an urban in an urban space, that people from various social ranks, they come and interact. Now here you will find there is a sort of difference in the social stations or in the social ranks of the people. That's why a city space is more multicultural, and it is cosmopolitan at the same time. I should not use the word multicultural, but it's more cosmopolitan, because you will find that people from various social stations and social ranks, they are coming together and they are interacting. But when you will go to a rural space, you will find that most of the people, they are from the same social space and they are interacting. And that's why Wordsworth says that their state is something somewhat pure. And that's why the language that comes up, because of their interaction, that is without any kind of social vanity, because there is no impurity in them. Suppose when vanity comes up, when vanity appears, suppose a man from the higher social rank is interacting with a man from the social lower rank, so because of this indifference in their social status, particular man from the higher rank can show their vanity, and the man who is in the lower rank, he or she has to accept that vanity, and has to feel the inferior status of his or her social position. So because of this indifference in the social rank, there is a sort of the language that comes up of their interaction. The language is vanity. That is in the urban social space. But when we are okay, because of the sameness of their social rank, you won't find that there is any kind of social vanity in their language. They convey their feelings and notions in simple and unelaborated expressions. So he says that the language has unelaborated expression, and their language is simple at the same time. That's why Wordsworth says that the language he has chosen for poetry is a language of the low and the rustic people, who are unaffected by all the artificialities that we find in the urban landscape, in the urban social space. Now he talks of the diction of poetry. Regarding diction, he made a number of statements that you will find in Wordsworth's criticism. We don't need that. We only need those parts which actually Coleridge criticized in Biographia Literaria. We made a number of statements regarding the language and diction of poetry. What should be the language and diction of poetry? So he said that the language should be the language of the low and rustic people. Of this, he made the statements that the diction and language of the poetry should be the language of the low and rustic people, and which remains unaffected by all the artificialities, and this language is closely related with nature. They are much more emphatic, and they are devoid of any kind of social value, which can communicate more powerfully, more emphatically. Now, regarding these statements, on Wordsworth's ideas about the choice of language and diction, Coleridge actually departs from Wordsworth's idea, and he controverts the following parts. He says, a selection or the real language of men. We will discuss it in the next section. That he says that selection, Coleridge says that when I am selecting something from a given thing, that means I am a part of the politics, because selection means there is a sort of rejection. When I am selecting something, that means I rejected many things and I selected something. So when I am selecting something, it no longer remains, the selected thing no longer remains the unaffected, undisturbed, pure thing. It is selected out of the many because it has certain qualities which are superior to the other things which are rejected. When I am selecting something, that means that particular thing has certain positive qualities which the other things which have been rejected, they lack. That's why it has been selected. So I am selecting a language, this of the real men. So it no longer remains the pure, unaffected thing, because it has been selected. The real language of men, the language of these men, Coleridge points out this, the language of these men, that means men in low and rustic life. I propose to myself to imitate. Wordsworth says that I propose to myself to imitate this language, or the language of these men. It's possible to adopt the very language of man. He says that I propose to myself to imitate the language of these men as far as possible. So that is, he draws a limit. I can only up to that limit which will go with the composition of my poetry, and I have to limit my process of adoption, because if I don't make the limit, if I don't draw a limit, it will ultimately affect the very composition of my literary endeavor, the literary production I'm writing, the poem I'm writing, my poetry. So as far as he is not doing that without any kind of restraint. So restraint is there. He is conscious that after some time, I have to draw the line, that I will take up to this, then I will stop, I will limit. Because what Coleridge said, that when writing poetry, you need to know the measurement, the balance, where you will start and where you will stop, what you will take and what you will not take. So this process of selection and rejection, this as far as possibility, all these things actually shows that what Wordsworth wanted to propose for in his choice of diction and language of the low and rustic people for writing poetry, it is not always correct, or it has certain contradictions in it, because Wordsworth says that I will take as far as possible, I'll take mostly, but not without any kind of control or restraint of this very man. And another line, between the language, Wordsworth said, what did Wordsworth say? Between the language of prose and that of metrical composition, that means poetry, between the language of prose and poetry, there neither is nor essential difference. So what Wordsworth said is that there is no difference in the language of prose and poetry. This 3 points, actually in the last section we will see that Coleridge actually objects to Wordsworth's ideas based on these 3 points. What? First, Wordsworth said that there is no difference between the language of prose and language of poetry. There is no essential difference. Coleridge objected to this, and Coleridge criticized what? That Wordsworth said that a selection of the real language of men, that I'm selecting means what? Coleridge will criticize this, the use of the word selection, and he will explore the very word, the politics that is inherent in the word selection. And another line, the language of this men I propose to myself to imitate, that I propose to myself to imitate the language of this men as far as possible. So Coleridge will point or focus on these 3 things, and he will build or construct his criticism of Wordsworth's theory of poetic creativity, or how a poetry is created. Okay, so I said that this will be a very small class. I think all of you have understood. Is there any problem? In the next class, we will start with Coleridge's criticism of Wordsworth, and which are actually based on these 3 points regarding Wordsworth's choice of rustic themes for his poetry, his choice of elastic language, and diction of poetry. Coleridge will criticize Wordsworth on these 3 points, that is, the themes. Wordsworth said something about his choice of theme for writing poetry, his choice of language about writing poetry, and his choice of diction for writing poetry. Coleridge will criticize Wordsworth on these 3 things. Yes? Repeat the last of the criticism. Okay, the last criticism. So I think it is clear that what was Wordsworth's point about his choice of theme. He said that I will pick up the low and rustic life. Regarding the choice of language, he said that I will take up the language of this low and rustic people, and he enumerated the reasons why he should take up this language and why he should take up these things. Regarding the third point, that is the diction of poetry, Wordsworth says that I propose to, as far as possible, to adopt the very language of men. So he says that I will propose to myself, that he says that I want to imitate the very language of these men who belong to the low and rustic life, who are from this low and rustic life. And he says that a selection of the real language of men, he says that I will select from the language of this man. Now Coleridge will criticize that something, that means you are rejecting many things. So when you are selecting something, that no longer remains in their unaffected pure state. You selected something because that particular thing has something different from the other things which has been rejected. So there is a difference. So when you are selecting, you are distancing it from the other things which were there, and that means it no longer remained in its primal impure state. So Coleridge will criticize that when you are selecting something, it no longer remains pure. It no longer remains pure, but it becomes something purified. Okay, and then he will criticize Wordsworth's point that regarding the choice of diction for writing poetry, Wordsworth said that there is no essential difference between the language of poetry and the language of prose. Coleridge will criticize these points, or which Wordsworth has made as a part of his theory of poetic diction and his theory of poetic language and okay. Is it clear? Now in the next discuss in details Coleridge's criticism of Wordsworth. He will criticize Wordsworth on the themes of poetry. He will criticize Wordsworth on rustic language. He will criticize on poetic diction. So on these particular 3 points, he will criticize Wordsworth and his ideas on the poetic creation, and Wordsworth's idea about the creation and the nature of poetry. On theme of poetry, what I said, the 3 things that I discussed right now, that is what Ananya Sarkar. Okay. When the rustic language is pure or original, then why Wordsworth thought to purify it? Yes, that is the thing. And on this particular point, Coleridge will criticize Wordsworth that I said that there is a basic difference between the word pure and purifying. Something is pure, that means it remains in it is there in its primal form. It remains unaffected. But when I am purifying it, that means that something added to that which actually disturbs its primal form. And when I am purifying that, that means I am separating the things which are not needed in that form to purify that. So purification means there is an external intervention in it. That's why purification happens. That is the thing. So Coleridge will criticize Wordsworth on this point, that if the language that you are taking as a language of your poem, which belongs to the low and rustic life, if that is pure, then why do you need to purify that? That means you are intervening in that pure thing to purify it. Means you are separating something from what you consider as pure. You are separating something from what you consider as pure. That's why you are purifying it. That means you are selecting something. When you are selecting something, you are at the same time rejecting the things which are not needed. So when you are purifying, that means you are intervening and disturbing its primal form to make something out of that which serves your purpose. So when you are taking up the language of the common rustic people for poetry, you are making certain changes in that language. That means that language no longer remains in its primal pure form. You are modifying it, you are changing it. So when you are changing it, Coleridge will point out this, that you need to work on the language for some time to make it more usable for poetry. Is it okay? So on these 3 points, that is the theme of poetry, rustic language and poetic diction, Coleridge will criticize Wordsworth's idea. I'll tell you the next time of the class, the next day. Today evening I have a class with the 4th semester, and after that I'll slot. Thank you. Have a nice time.